The thunder rumbled across the vast Montana sky as Gabriella Hayes crouched in the corner of her small cabin, trembling as her husband Frank's heavy footsteps approached once more. It was 1876, and the promise of a better life in the western frontier had turned into a prison of fear and pain for the young woman who had once dreamed of adventure beyond her Pennsylvania hometown. "Where's my dinner, woman?" Frank's voice slurred with whiskey and rage as he towered over her. At 28, Gabriella had been married to him for 7 years, watching him transform from a charming suitor into a monster she no longer recognized. "It's nearly ready, Frank," she whispered, struggling to her feet. The bruises from yesterday's beating still colored her arms in ugly purple patches. "The stew needs just a few more." His hand struck her face before she could finish, sending her sprawling back to the rough wooden floor. "I work all day at the mine and I come home to excuses." He yanked her up by her chestnut hair. "You're nothing but a burden, you hear me?" Gabriella said nothing, having learned long ago that words only fueled his anger. Frank's mining job had dried up months ago, but admitting that would only intensify his rage. Instead, he spent his days drinking away what little money they had left. "Answer me," he roared, throwing her against the table. Dishes clattered to the floor as Gabriella felt something snap in her hip. Pain exploded through her body, stealing her breath. "Yes, Frank," she gasped, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. Frank's eyes, bloodshot and wild, narrowed as he advanced again. "Maybe I ought to teach you a better lesson this time." What followed was the worst beating of Gabriella's life. Each blow seemed calculated to cause maximum pain without killing her. By the time Frank stumbled out to return to the saloon, Gabriella lay motionless on the cabin floor, blood pooling beneath her head, her legs refusing to obey her desperate commands to move. "I can't stay," she whispered to the empty room. "He'll kill me next time." Hours passed as she dragged herself inch by painful inch toward the door. Night fell completely, bringing with it a spring thunderstorm that pounded against the cabin roof. When she finally reached the door, Gabriella used the last of her strength to pull herself over the threshold and onto the muddy path outside. The rain soaked her immediately, washing away blood but chilling her to the bone. Lightning illuminated the desolate landscape as she crawled forward, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to get away. Each movement was agony, her legs completely numb now, her vision blurring as consciousness threatened to leave her. "Please," she prayed to the stormy sky, "just let me die somewhere he can't find me." Just as darkness began to close in around her mind, hoofbeats approached through the rain. Gabriella tried to hide, terrified it might be Frank returning, but her body refused to move another inch. A tall figure dismounted from a magnificent black stallion, approaching cautiously. Lightning flashed, revealing a man in a worn duster and wide-brimmed hat. "Madam?" His voice was deep but gentle, nothing like Frank's alcohol-roughened growl. "Are you hurt?" Gabriella could only whimper in response as he knelt beside her. His face came into focus, strong-jawed with kind eyes that widened as he took in her condition. "Good Lord," he breathed, gently brushing matted hair from her face. "Who did this to you, please?" she managed to whisper. "He'll come back." Understanding darkened the stranger's expression. Without another word, he carefully slid his arms beneath her broken body. Gabriella cried out as pain lanced through her. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I need to get you somewhere safe." With surprising tenderness for such strong hands, he lifted her against his chest. As he carried her to his horse, he looked down at her pale face and said words that would change Gabriella's life forever. "You'll rest now. I promise no one will hurt you again." The man who rescued her that stormy night was Yates Dawson, a cattle rancher whose property bordered the mining town. As he settled her carefully atop his horse and mounted behind her, supporting her broken body with strong arms, Gabriella drifted in and out of consciousness. "Stay with me," his voice urged in her ear as they rode through the downpour. "My ranch is just beyond that ridge. Got a good housekeeper who knows more about doctoring than most physicians." Gabriella struggled to focus on his words, on the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, on anything but the pain that threatened to pull her under. Why are you helping me?" she managed. "Because it's what decent folks do," he replied simply. And there aren't enough decent folks left in these parts. The journey seemed endless, though in reality it took less than an hour to reach the sprawling ranch house that loomed through the rain. Lights glowed warmly from within, and as they approached, the front door flew open. Yates Dawson. "What in heaven's name are you doing out in this storm?" A stout woman with iron-gray hair stood silhouetted in the doorway. Her scolding tone died instantly when she saw the burden in his arms. "Lord have mercy, Mrs. Cook, this lady needs help," Yates said as he dismounted carefully, still cradling Gabriella. "Her husband beat her something terrible. Bring her in, Mrs. Cook urged, already rushing back inside to prepare. "I'll get the spare room ready." Yates carried Gabriella into a home unlike any she had ever seen. Despite her pain-hazed vision, she registered the quality furniture, the polished wood floors, the scent of beeswax and fresh bread. He took her up a wide staircase and into a bedroom where Mrs. Cook was hastily turning down crisp white sheets. "Careful now," the older woman instructed as Yates lowered Gabriella onto the bed. "Poor dear's been through enough." As Mrs. Cook began removing Gabriella's sodden, blood-stained clothing, Yates respectfully turned to leave. "Thank you," Gabriella whispered, catching his sleeve with trembling fingers. His eyes, warm brown like autumn leaves, met hers. "You're safe now. Get some rest." The next days passed in a blur of pain and fevered dreams for Gabriella. Mrs. Cook, whose first name turned out to be Henrietta, tended to her injuries with practiced hands and herbal remedies. "Your left leg is broken," she informed Gabriella on the third day, when lucidity finally returned. "And you've got 2 cracked ribs, not to mention more bruises than I've ever seen on a living person." Gabriella stared at the ceiling, memories of Frank's rage flooding back. "He'll come looking for me." Mrs. Cook's expression hardened. "Let him try." "Mr. Dawson has already informed Sheriff Barton about the situation. That husband of yours won't set foot on this property if he values his hide." Despite these reassurances, Gabriella couldn't shake her fear. Every time she heard horses approaching the ranch, she tensed, expecting Frank to burst through the door and drag her back to their cabin. On the 5th day of her recovery, Yates himself appeared at her bedroom door, hat in hand. "May I come in, Mrs. Hayes?" Gabriella nodded, pulling the blankets higher despite being fully clothed in a borrowed nightgown. Yates entered but remained standing respectfully near the doorway. "I wanted to check how you're feeling," he said. "Better, thanks to you and Mrs. Cook," Gabriella replied. She studied him properly. For the first time he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners. His dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, and his shoulders filled the doorframe with an easy strength that somehow didn't frighten her. "I'm glad to hear it." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I also wanted to let you know that I've spoken with the sheriff. Your husband has been warned to stay away from you." Gabriella's laugh was bitter. "Warnings won't stop Frank. Nothing stops him when he's drinking. This one might." Yates's voice hardened slightly. "Sheriff made it clear that if he comes near you again, he'll face charges. And I've made it equally clear that he's not welcome on my land." "Why are you doing all this?" Gabriella asked, the question that had been burning in her mind for days finally escaping. "You don't know me. I'm nothing to you." Yates was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "My mother was in a situation similar to yours," he finally said. "No one helped her. I was just a boy, couldn't do anything but watch. I swore if I ever had the chance to help someone else, I would." The simple honesty in his words brought tears to Gabriella's eyes. She looked away, embarrassed by her emotion. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need," Yates continued gently, "until you're healed and until you decide what you want to do next." "I have nowhere to go," she admitted. "No family, no money. Don't worry about that now. Just focus on getting better." He nodded respectfully and turned to leave. "Mr. Dawson," Gabriella called after him. When he looked back, she said simply, "Thank you." A small smile touched his lips. "Call me Yates, please." As weeks turned into a month, Gabriella's body slowly healed under Mrs. Cook's care. Her spirit, however, remained fragile. Nightmares plagued her sleep, and sudden noises made her flinch. Still, There were moments of peace she hadn't experienced in years, sitting by the window watching the Montana wilderness stretch endlessly before her, listening to Mrs. Cook hum as she worked, or hearing Yates's deep voice as he gave instructions to his ranch hands. Once she could walk with the aid of a crutch, Gabriella insisted on helping around the house, unwilling to be a burden. "Nonsense," Mrs. Cook protested. "You're still healing." "Please," Gabriella insisted. "I need to do something, I need to be useful," so Mrs. Cook reluctantly allowed her to help with simple tasks, folding laundry, peeling potatoes, kneading bread dough. These ordinary activities became a form of therapy for Gabriella, reconnecting her to a sense of normalcy she'd lost during her years with Frank. She saw little of Yates during the day, as he was busy running the substantial cattle operation. But in the evenings, he would join her and Mrs. Cook for dinner, his presence bringing a quiet comfort to the table. He never asked Gabriella about her marriage or pressed her for details about her past. Instead, he spoke of ranch matters, local news, or sometimes told stories about his childhood that made her laugh despite herself. One evening, as summer transitioned into early autumn, Gabriella was sitting on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold when Yates joined her. He handed her a cup of coffee and settled into the chair beside hers. "How's the leg today?" he asked. "Better, Mrs. Cook says I might be able to manage without the crutch soon." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sky deepen from gold to purple. Finally, Yates spoke again. "Mrs. Cook tells me you've been having nightmares." Gabriella stiffened slightly. "They'll pass." "My mother had them too," he said quietly. "For years after we got away from my father." She turned to look at him. "You got away," Yates nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon, "when I was 12. She finally found the courage to leave, took me and my sister to St. Louis to live with her brother. My father never found us." "You were lucky," Gabriella murmured. "We were, but it wasn't just luck, it was her courage." He turned to meet her gaze directly. "Like yours," Gabriella shook her head. "I didn't leave, I was trying to, but I couldn't even walk." "If you hadn't found me." Her voice trailed off. "But you did try," Yates insisted. "Do you know how many women never even attempt it? They stay until—" He stopped abruptly, but Gabriella knew what he hadn't said, "until they're killed." "I stayed too long," she admitted. "I kept thinking he would change back to the man I married, or that I could somehow be better, do better, and he wouldn't get so angry." Yates's hand covered hers briefly, warm and reassuring. "That's not how it works. My father was the same. Nothing my mother did was ever good enough." The understanding in his eyes unlocked something in Gabriella. For the first time, she began to speak about her marriage, how Frank had courted her with promises and charm, how the first blow had come just months after their wedding, how each apology had been followed by worse violence. Yates listened without interruption, his face grave but compassionate. When she finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, he offered her his handkerchief. "You survived, Gabriella," he said softly. "That's what matters now." The use of her first name, spoken with such gentle respect, made her realize he'd never addressed her so personally before. It felt right somehow, as if they'd crossed an invisible boundary from strangers to something else. Not quite friends yet, but something more than rescuer and rescued. "What will happen to Frank?" she asked finally. Yates sighed. "Sheriff Barton says he's been spending most of his time at the saloon, getting more belligerent by the day. He's made some threats, but so far he's stayed away from the ranch." Fear knotted in Gabriella's stomach. "He won't give up. He'll see me as his property." "You're not property," Yates said firmly. "You're a person with the right to live without fear." The conviction in his voice warmed something long cold within her. For the first time, Gabriella allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a life where she might actually find happiness again. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Gabriella was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Cook prepare breakfast when they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Through the window, she saw a smartly dressed woman in her 40s climb down from a small buggy. "Who's that?" Gabriella asked nervously. Mrs. Cook peered out. "That's Judith Landon, the school teacher from town." "Wonder what brings her out this way?" Minutes later, Yates escorted Miss Landon into the kitchen. The schoolteacher's shrewd eyes took in Gabriella's fading bruises and the crutch leaning against her chair. Mrs. Hayes, she said briskly. I've heard about your situation. I've come to offer you a position. Gabriella blinked in surprise. A position? My assistant at the school has left to get married. I need someone who can help with the younger children's reading and arithmetic. The pay isn't much, but it includes room and board in my home in town. Stunned, Gabriella looked from Miss Landon to Yates, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. I don't know what to say, Gabriella stammered. I've never taught before. Can you read, write, and do sums? Miss Landon asked. Yes, of course. And do you like children? Very much, Gabriella said honestly. She and Frank had never had children, something she'd eventually come to see as a blessing given his violence. Then you're qualified. Miss Landon glanced at Yates. Mr. Dawson mentioned you might be looking for a way to support yourself. So this was Yates's doing. Gabriella felt a rush of conflicting emotions, gratitude for his thoughtfulness, but also a strange disappointment at the prospect of leaving the ranch. It's very kind of you, she said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm ready. The position won't be available until after harvest when the new school term begins, Miss Landon said. That gives you nearly 6 weeks. Surely you'll be recovered by then. Most likely, Gabriella conceded, glancing at Mrs. Cook, who nodded confirmation. Think about it, Miss Landon said, rising to leave. The offer stands. Good day, Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Dawson. After she departed, an awkward silence filled the kitchen. Finally, Gabriella turned to Yates. You arranged this, he shifted uncomfortably. I mentioned to Miss Landon that you might be looking for honest work. The rest was her idea. I see. Gabriella wasn't sure why she felt hurt. Of course Yates would want to find a suitable arrangement for her. She couldn't stay at his ranch indefinitely. She was a burden, a responsibility he had taken on out of kindness but surely wanted to relinquish. If you don't want the position, he began. No, it's perfect, she interrupted quickly. You've been more than generous and I've imposed long enough. It would be wonderful. Something flickered in Yates's eyes, but he merely nodded. Well, you have time to decide. For the next week, Gabriella threw herself into her recovery with new determination. If she was to become a teacher's assistant, she would need to be fully mobile. Each day, she pushed herself to walk a little farther without the crutch, ignoring the ache in her mending leg. She also began to take her meals in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands and their families, rather than in the main house with Yates and Mrs. Cook. She told herself it was to become comfortable around more people again, preparation for her new life in town. But in truth, a growing awareness of Yates made their quiet dinners increasingly difficult. She found herself noticing things, the way the corner of his mouth quirked up when he was amused, but trying not to show it, the gentleness of his hands as he passed the bread, the rich timbre of his laugh on the rare occasions she managed to surprise one out of him. These observations stirred feelings Gabriella wasn't prepared to examine. Better to create distance now, she reasoned. Better to prepare for the life awaiting her in town, away from his disconcerting presence. But fate had other plans. 10 days after Miss Landon's visit, disaster struck. Gabriella was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard shouting from the corral. Looking up, she saw ranch hands scrambling as a newly broken horse reared wildly, throwing its rider. The man hit the ground hard and didn't move. Without thinking, Gabriella dropped the laundry and hurried across the yard, her limp still pronounced but forgotten in her concern. By the time she reached the corral, several men were gathered around the fallen rider. It's the boss, one of them said grimly as she approached. Took a bad fall. Pushing through the circle of cowboys, Gabriella found Yates lying unconscious, blood seeping from a gash on his temple where he'd struck a fence post. Get him to the house, she ordered, surprising herself with her authoritative tone. Carefully, and someone ride for the doctor. 4 men carefully lifted Yates and carried him toward the main house. Gabriella hurried ahead, calling for Mrs. Cook, who emerged from the kitchen wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. Lord have mercy, the housekeeper gasped when she saw Yates's limp form. Bring him upstairs to his room. As the cowboys maneuvered their burden up the stairs, Mrs. Cook turned to Gabriella. I'll need clean water, bandages, and my medicine box from the pantry. Grateful for something useful to do, Gabriella gathered the supplies and followed them to Yates's bedroom, a simply furnished space dominated by a large four-poster bed. The men laid him gently on the quilt and retreated, leaving Gabriella and Mrs. Cook to tend to him. "Head wounds bleed something fierce, even when they're not too serious," Mrs. Cook muttered as she cleaned the gash. "But this one's deep, and I don't like that he hasn't woken up." "Will he be all right?" Gabriella asked, helping to hold clean bandages to the wound. Mrs. Cook's lips thinned. "Hard to say. We'll know more when the doctor gets here. For now, we keep him still and watch for fever." The doctor arrived 2 hours later, a grizzled man named Porter who smelled of whiskey but had steady hands and shrewd eyes. After examining Yates, he stitched the wound and looked gravely at Mrs. Cook and Gabriella. "Concussion for certain," he diagnosed. "Possibly worse. We won't know until he wakes up, if he wakes up." Gabriella's heart seemed to stop. "What do you mean if?" Dr. Porter shrugged. "Sometimes with head injuries, folks just don't come back. Their body keeps going, but their mind." He tapped his own temple. "Their mind stays somewhere else." After giving instructions for Yates's care, the doctor left, promising to return the following day. Mrs. Cook organized the ranch hands, ensuring the operation would continue running in Yates's absence, then returned to the sick room where Gabriella sat beside the bed. "You should rest," Mrs. Cook told her gently. "Your leg—" "I'm fine," Gabriella insisted. "I'll sit with him." "You have enough to manage." Mrs. Cook studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Call if there's any change or if you need to be spelled." But Gabriella didn't call. Hour after hour, she sat beside Yates's bed, watching his chest rise and fall, bathing his face with cool water when fever set in, talking to him softly when no one else was around. "You have to wake up," she whispered as night fell and shadows filled the room. "You have a ranch to run. People who depend on you." She hesitated, then added in an even softer voice, "People who care about you." For 3 days and nights, Gabriella barely left Yates's side, snatching brief moments of sleep in the chair beside his bed. Mrs. Cook brought food she barely touched, and the ranch hands stopped by regularly for updates, their weathered faces tight with worry. On the 4th morning, as dawn light filtered through the curtains, Gabriella was dozing in her chair when a hoarse voice startled her awake. "Water." Her eyes flew open to find Yates looking at her, confused but conscious. Relief flooded through her as she hurried to pour water from the pitcher beside the bed. "Careful," she cautioned, supporting his head as he drank. "Not too fast." After a few sips, he sank back against the pillows, studying her face. "You look terrible," he observed weakly. A surprised laugh escaped her. "You're one to talk." His hand found hers on the bed cover. "How long?" 4 days, she told him, fighting the urge to grasp his fingers more tightly. "You fell from that new stallion, hit your head on a fence post." Yates winced. "I remember, stubborn beast." His gaze sharpened. "Have you been here the whole time?" Gabriella flushed. "Someone needed to watch you." "Mrs. Cook has the entire ranch to manage in your absence," she interrupted. "Besides, I wanted to help, after everything you've done for me." His fingers tightened around hers. "Thank you." Something in his voice made her look up and meet his eyes, clear now and filled with an emotion that made her breath catch. Before she could identify it, the door opened and Mrs. Cook bustled in. "Praise the Lord," the housekeeper exclaimed when she saw Yates awake. "About time you rejoined the land of the living, Mr. Dawson." Gabriella slipped her hand from his and stood, suddenly aware of her rumpled appearance and the impropriety of spending nights in an unmarried man's bedroom, even in such circumstances. "I'll let you rest," she said quickly, and fled the room before Yates could respond. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, heart racing. The look in his eyes, she hadn't imagined it. There had been warmth there, warmth directed at her, but what did it mean? And more importantly, how did she feel about it? The answer came to her with startling clarity. She cared for Yates Dawson. Somewhere between the night he had rescued her and this moment, she had developed feelings for him that went far beyond gratitude. The realization terrified her. She was still legally married to Frank, still broken in ways she didn't fully understand. And Yates, he was her rescuer, her benefactor. Any feelings he might have for her could simply be pity or a misplaced sense of responsibility. Better to maintain distance, she decided. Better to focus on her recovery and the teaching position awaiting her in town. But over the following weeks, as Yates regained his strength and gradually resumed his duties around the ranch, maintaining distance proved impossible. His injury had changed something between them, shifting the balance of their relationship. No longer was she simply the damaged woman he had rescued. Now they had cared for each other, seen each other at their most vulnerable. One evening in late September, Gabriella sat on the porch, watching a spectacular sunset and wondering how many more such evenings she would enjoy at the ranch. Miss Landon had sent word that the school term would begin in 2 weeks, and she expected Gabriella to move into town the week prior to become familiar with her duties. The sound of boots on the porch steps drew her attention. Yates approached, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to her and took the seat beside her. "Beautiful evening," he remarked, looking out at the gold-drenched mountains. Gabriella nodded, acutely aware of his presence beside her. "One of the last warm ones, I expect. Winter comes early here, doesn't it?" "It does," Yates agreed. "First snow usually falls by mid-October." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence for a while. Finally, Yates spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "Miss Landon came by the south pasture today, said you'll be starting at the school soon." "Yes," Gabriella confirmed. "The week after next." Yates nodded slowly. "Are you looking forward to it?" "I think so," she said honestly. "I've always liked children, and it will be good to have purpose again." "You've had purpose here," Yates said quietly, "more than you know." Gabriella turned to look at him, uncertain of his meaning. "I've tried to earn my keep, but that's not what I meant." He set his coffee cup down and turned to face her fully. "Gabriella, he paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I've come to care for you a great deal." Her heart seemed to stop, then restart at double speed. "Yates, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know you've been through a terrible ordeal. I know you're still married, legally if not in your heart. I know there are 1,000 reasons why I shouldn't say this. But I can't let you go to town without telling you how I feel." "How do you feel?" Gabriella whispered, needing to hear him say it. His eyes, warm and earnest, met hers. "I love you, not out of pity or some misguided notion of protection. I love your strength, your kindness, your resilience. I love the way you stand in the garden at dawn, as if you're drinking in the day before it begins. I love how you treat every person on this ranch with respect, from Mrs. Cook to the youngest stable boy." Tears welled in Gabriella's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Yates assured her. "I'm not asking for promises. I just wanted you to know before you leave that there's a place for you here if you ever want it." Unable to find words, Gabriella reached out and took his hand. For a long moment they sat in silence, hands clasped, watching as the last light faded from the mountains. Finally, Gabriella spoke, her voice barely audible. "I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of feeling anything again, of trusting anyone, even myself." She looked down at their joined hands. "And yet I find myself thinking of you in ways that terrify me, because what if I'm wrong again? What if I can't tell the difference between kindness and something else?" Yates's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "I understand, and I'll wait, Gabriella. However long it takes for you to be sure." She raised her eyes to his. "What about Frank?" A shadow crossed Yates's face. "There are legal ways to end a marriage. Sheriff Barton says he has enough evidence of Frank's abuse to support your case. It would take time, but it's possible." Hope, fragile but undeniable, blossomed in Gabriella's chest. "I never thought I could be free of him." "You already are," Yates said firmly, "in every way that matters." That night, Gabriella lay awake long after the house had gone silent, her mind churning with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. A life without fear. A future with a man who valued her, who saw her strength rather than exploiting her vulnerabilities. But was it possible? Or was she simply trading one dependency for another? No, she decided finally. She would take the teaching position. She would stand on her own 2 feet, build a life for herself in town. And if in time her feelings for Yates proved to be more than gratitude, more than a reaction to his kindness, then perhaps they could build something together as equals. With this resolution firm in her mind, Gabriella finally drifted off to sleep. But her peaceful slumber was short-lived. Just before dawn, she woke to the acrid smell of smoke. Sitting bolt upright, she saw orange light flickering under her door. Heart racing, she grabbed her shawl and flung the door open to find the hallway filling with smoke. "Fire!" she shouted, rushing to pound on Mrs. Cook's door across the hall. "Wake up, the house is on fire!" Mrs. Cook emerged in her nightgown, eyes wide with fear. "Lord have mercy, we need to get everyone out." Together, they hurried down the hall, rousing the two young maids who slept in the smaller bedrooms. As they reached Yates's door, it swung open and he appeared, already pulling on his boots. "Get to the yard," he ordered, his voice calm despite the urgency in his eyes. "I'll make sure everyone's out, then try to save what I can." "Be careful," Gabriella pleaded, but he was already heading toward the stairs, which were beginning to be engulfed in flames. Outside, the ranch hands were forming a bucket brigade from the well to the house, but it was clear the fire had too much of a head start. The entire front of the house was ablaze, flames leaping into the pre-dawn sky. "Where's Mr. Dawson?" one of the cowboys asked as he ran past with a bucket. "Still inside, checking the rooms," Mrs. Cook replied, her face ashen. Minutes ticked by with no sign of Yates. The maids were sobbing, and Mrs. Cook's prayers grew more frantic. Just as Gabriella was about to rush back toward the burning house, a figure emerged from a side door, carrying an armload of ledgers and papers. "Yates!" Gabriella cried, running toward him despite her still mending leg. He dropped the papers and caught her as she nearly collapsed against him. "I'm all right," he assured her, his face streaked with soot. "Everyone's out." As they stood together watching the house burn, one of the ranch hands approached. "Boss, I found something you should see." He led them to the back of the property, where the grass was trampled in a clear path leading to the woods. At the edge of the trees lay an empty whiskey bottle. "Someone set this fire deliberately," the cowboy said grimly. Yates's arm tightened around Gabriella. "Frank," he said quietly so only she could hear, cold fear washed over her. "How would he know I was here?" "Small town," Yates replied. "Word gets around, and he must have heard about you taking the teaching position." "This is my fault," Gabriella whispered, horror dawning. "He tried to kill all of you because of me." "No," Yates said firmly. "This is his doing, not yours. You're not responsible for his actions." By mid-morning, the main house was a smoldering ruin. Miraculously, no one had been injured, and the bunkhouse and barns remained untouched. But the beautiful home that had provided Gabriella sanctuary was gone. Sheriff Barton arrived shortly after sunrise, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked Yates. Yates glanced at Gabriella, who nodded slightly. "Frank Hayes," he said. "Mrs. Hayes's husband. He's made threats before." Sheriff Barton's eyes narrowed. "I'll bring him in for questioning, but unless someone saw him." "I understand," Yates said. "Meanwhile, we need somewhere for the women to stay." "They can come to town," Sheriff Barton offered. "My wife runs the boarding house." But Gabriella shook her head. "No, if Frank did this, he'll be watching for me in town." "You can't stay here," Mrs. Cook protested. "The bunkhouse is no place for ladies, and with the main house gone, there's the line shack up by creekside pasture," one of the ranch hands suggested. "It's small but solid, and far enough from the road that no one would think to look there." Yates considered this. "It's not much, but it would be safe. Mrs. Cook, would you be willing to stay there with Mrs. Hayes while I get the hands started on rebuilding?" The housekeeper nodded resolutely. "Of course, we'll make do." By nightfall, Gabriella and Mrs. Cook were settled in the small cabin that served as shelter for cowboys working the distant pastures in summer. It consisted of one room with a stone fireplace, two narrow bunks, and a rough-hewn table with benches. But it was clean, the roof was sound, and there was a good supply of firewood stacked against the outer wall. "Not what you're used to, I'm sure," Mrs. Cook apologized as she arranged their few salvaged belongings. "I've lived in worse," Gabriella said honestly. Her cabin with Frank had been little better and had never felt as safe as this simple shelter. That night, as they lay in their narrow bunks listening to the wind in the pines, Mrs. Cook spoke softly in the darkness. "He loves you, you know." Gabriella didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I know." "And you," she sighed, staring at the shadowed ceiling. "I think I might love him too, but I'm still married and Frank is still out there, angry enough to burn down a house with people sleeping inside." "Marriages end," Mrs. Cook said practically. And men like Frank Hayes eventually meet the justice they deserve. What do you mean? The older woman's voice was matter of fact. I've lived out here for 40 years, child. I've seen how frontier justice works. If Frank did set that fire, the men of this ranch won't let it go unpunished, sheriff or no sheriff. The thought should have horrified Gabriella. Instead, she felt a guilty relief at the idea that Frank might finally face consequences for his actions. 3 days later, Yates rode up to the line shack, his expression grave. Gabriella was outside hanging laundry but rushed to meet him as he dismounted. "What's happened?" she asked, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. "They found Frank," he said without preamble. "In the saloon in town, bragging about teaching me a lesson for harboring his wife." Gabriella's stomach twisted. "Did the sheriff arrest him?" He tried. Yates ran a hand through his hair. Frank resisted, pulled a knife. Sheriff Barton had no choice but to shoot. The world seemed to tilt beneath Gabriella's feet. "Is he?" "He's dead, Gabriella." Yates's eyes were steady on hers. "Frank can't hurt you anymore." She sank onto a nearby stump, emotions crashing through her in overwhelming waves: shock, relief, guilt, and underneath it all, a terrible liberating joy that made her ashamed of herself. "I don't know how to feel," she whispered. Yates knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "You don't have to know right now. You can feel everything or nothing. There's no right way to react." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "He was a monster at the end, but once I loved him. Once he was kind." "I know." Yates squeezed her hands gently. "And you can mourn that man, the one you married, without feeling guilty about being relieved that the man he became can't hurt you anymore." His understanding, his complete acceptance of her complicated emotions, broke something open inside Gabriella. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his shoulder, and finally allowed herself to truly weep for the girl she had been, for the dreams she had lost, for the years of fear and pain. Yates held her through it all, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other steady on her back, his presence a silent promise that she wasn't alone. When her tears finally subsided, Gabriella straightened and wiped her face. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Yates said. "Miss Landon still wants you for the teaching position if you're interested," or, he hesitated, "or you could stay here." "Here," she glanced at the tiny line shack, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not in this cabin, on the ranch. We'll have the main house rebuilt before winter sets in proper." "As what?" Gabriella asked softly. "Your housekeeper, your guest." Yates took a deep breath. "As my wife, if you'll have me." The directness of his proposal took her breath away. "Yates, I'm not even properly widowed yet." "I know the timing is unconventional," he admitted. "But out here, practical matters sometimes outweigh proprieties. Winter's coming. The house needs rebuilding. And I love you, Gabriella Hayes. I don't want to pressure you, but I want you to know that offer is on the table." She studied his face, so open, so different from Frank's calculated charm, and felt a certainty settle in her heart. "Ask me again in 3 months," she said. "After I've stood on my own 2 feet for a while, after I've had time to be sure of my own mind." Understanding and respect filled his eyes. 3 months, he agreed. "I'll be here when you're ready." True to his word, Yates didn't pressure Gabriella over the following weeks. She took the teaching position in town, boarding with Miss Landon as planned. Each day, she guided young children through their letters and numbers, finding unexpected joy in their progress and innocent affection. On Sundays after church, Yates would drive her out to the ranch to see the progress on the new house, which was rising quickly under the skilled hands of his cowboys and carpenters he'd hired from town. These visits were her favorite part of the week, riding beside him in his wagon, listening to him describe his plans for spring planting, watching him interact with his men with easy authority and genuine respect. As autumn deepened into winter, Gabriella found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. The nightmares came less frequently. She could hear a man raise his voice without flinching. She began to recognize her own worth beyond mere survival. And through it all, she found herself falling more deeply in love with Yates Dawson, not because he had rescued her, but because of who he was. Honorable, patient, kind without being weak, strong without being cruel. A man who saw her as an equal partner, not a possession. The new house was completed just before Thanksgiving, smaller than the original but sturdy and well-built, with large windows that filled the rooms with light. Mrs. Cook moved back to assume her role as housekeeper, but there was a bedroom waiting for Gabriella, should she choose to claim it. On the first Sunday in December, exactly 3 months after Frank's death, Gabriella rode out to the ranch as usual. Snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the rugged terrain into a glistening wonderland. As Yates helped her from the wagon, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, she knew it was time. "Can we walk?" she asked, nodding toward the creek that ran behind the new house. Yates raised an eyebrow but nodded, offering his arm. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a small footbridge over the ice-rimmed water. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" Gabriella asked, turning to face him. Yates thought for a moment. "I believe I asked if you were hurt," she smiled. "And then, when you picked me up, you told me I would rest now, that no one would hurt me again." Her eyes held his. "You've kept that promise." "I've tried," he said softly. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Gabriella continued, "about what it would mean to be your wife." Yates tensed slightly, and I've realized something important." She took a step closer to him. "When Frank asked me to marry him, I said yes because I thought I needed someone to take care of me. I thought I was too weak to stand alone." Pain flickered in Yates's eyes, but he remained silent, allowing her to finish. "But these past months," Gabriella continued, "I've proven to myself that I can stand alone. I can build a life of my own." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weather-roughened cheek. "So if I say yes to you now, it won't be because I need you, Yates Dawson. It will be because I choose you." Hope dawned in his expression. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you," Gabriella said simply, "and if your offer still stands, I would be honored to be your wife." Joy transformed Yates's face. Without a word, he lifted her in his arms, spinning her in a circle that sent snow flying around them. When he set her down, his eyes were shining. "I have loved you since the moment I found you in that storm," he confessed. "Not because you needed saving, but because even then, broken and afraid, you had a strength I could see, a light inside you that nothing had managed to extinguish." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver ring set with a single pearl. "I've been carrying this for 3 months, hoping," he said. "It was my grandmother's." Tears blurred Gabriella's vision as she held out her hand, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant for her. "When?" she asked softly. "Christmas Eve," Yates suggested. "If that's not too soon, we could be married in town with all your students there if you like, or here on the ranch with just our closest friends." "Here," Gabriella decided immediately. "This is where our story began, this is where it should continue." On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside the windows of the new ranch house, Gabriella Hayes became Gabriella Dawson in a simple ceremony attended by Mrs. Cook, Miss Landon, Sheriff Barton and his wife, and all the ranch hands and their families. She wore a dress of deep blue velvet, a wedding gift from Mrs. Cook, who had secretly ordered it from Denver months before. As Yates slipped a gold band alongside the pearl engagement ring, his eyes holding a promise that went beyond the words they had just exchanged, Gabriella felt the last shadows of her past finally release their hold on her heart. That night, as snow piled against the windows and firelight cast a golden glow throughout their bedroom, Yates and Gabriella discovered each other with tender patience. His touch, so different from the cruel hands she had known before, healed wounds deeper than any visible scars. "I never thought I could feel this way," she whispered in the darkness afterward, her head resting on his chest. Safe but not afraid, loved but not possessed. Yates's hand traced gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "This is how it should always be between a man and a woman. Equal partners cherishing each other." Spring came early that year, as if nature itself was celebrating their new beginning. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the pastures, Gabriella discovered she was carrying their first child. "Are you happy?" Yates asked when she told him the news, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Gabriella replied honestly. As her body changed with the growing child, Gabriella sometimes caught herself remembering the fear that had dominated her first marriage. But those memories grew fainter with each passing day, replaced by new ones. Yates singing to her belly at night, Mrs. Cook knitting tiny garments by the fire, the entire ranch seemingly holding its breath in anticipation of the new life that would soon join them. Their daughter arrived on a warm September evening, exactly 1 year after the night Yates had told Gabriella he loved her on the porch of the old house. They named her Hope, for what had sustained them through the darkest times. As Gabriella cradled her newborn daughter, with Yates sitting beside them on the bed, his face alight with wonder and love, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a broken woman crawling away from abuse, to a teacher standing on her own feet, to a wife and now mother cherished and cherishing in return. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked softly, noticing her thoughtful expression. Gabriella smiled, looking from her husband to her sleeping daughter. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst storms lead us to the safest harbors, and that rest isn't just the absence of pain, it's the presence of love." Yates leaned forward to kiss her forehead, then their daughter's. "And you'll rest now," he promised, echoing the words he had spoken on that stormy night that had changed both their lives. "Both of you always." In the years that followed, the Dawson Ranch prospered and grew. Hope was joined by 2 brothers, Ethan and James, and the house expanded to accommodate their growing family. Gabriella continued to teach part-time at the school in town, finding fulfillment in both her roles as educator and rancher's wife. The story of how they met became something of a legend in the county, how a cowboy had found a beaten woman in the storm, carried her to safety, and promised her rest. But only Gabriella and Yates knew the full truth of their journey. That true healing had come not from rescue, but from the patient rebuilding of trust, the careful nurturing of love, and the courage to believe in second chances. And on nights when the Montana wind howled around their home, reminding Gabriella of that first terrible storm, Yates would hold her close and whisper, "You're safe now. You'll always be safe with me," and she was.